if you fast a patient with autoimmune disease, if you take food away, they respond and they recover very quickly. Now, you can't starve somebody to death, and that's the conundrum. You can't take food away permanently. If you take food away for a few days, guess what happens to their symptoms? They start to recover very quickly. The second thing that I discovered is that gluten is the only known cause of autoimmune disease from food source. And the third thing I discovered is that vitamin and mineral deficiencies, nutritional deficiencies, would contribute or perpetuate autoimmune disease. And so in the example of autoimmune disease, one of the most common things, vitamin D deficiency, is a known trigger factor for celiac disease. It's a known trigger factor for other autoimmune diseases. Essential fatty acids, omega-3 fatty acids are known, it's a known trigger to perpetuate autoimmune disease. So after I quit the VA hospital because they wouldn't let me practice nutrition in the VA hospital, I brought all this literature, thousands of studies, to the doctors at the VA hospital. Nobody wanted to do any of it. All I ever heard was nutrition's not important, nutrition's not important. So I left the VA hospital and started my own practice. And one of my very first patients was a young boy named Michael. Michael was terminal. He had 6 months. He had been diagnosed with juvenile rheumatoid arthritis. And he had a permanent put in his arm because he was frequenting the hospital so often for IV fluids. Make-A-Wish Foundation gave Michael his wish. They took him and his family to the Galapagos Islands. That's how terminal Michael was. His mom had juvenile rheumatoid arthritis. So we set out to test him to see what we needed to do to help him. And so we ended up finding he was gluten sensitive. I used genetic testing to test for gluten sensitivity because the biopsy is a flawed marker. Although it's positive, if it's positive, it's definitely positive. But you can do 9, 10 biopsies and they're all negative, and the last one's positive. It takes you 35, 40 years to get a diagnosis. You can do the same thing with the blood test. The blood tests are very inaccurate. So we look at genetics because the gene itself shows us whether or not a person's going to react to gluten. It doesn't show us whether they are reacting. It shows us whether if they eat it, they will react. Right? It's kind of like that breathing oxygen underwater. We know you don't have genetics to breathe oxygen underwater. Well, we measure your genes to determine whether or not you have the genes that will react to gluten if you ingest it. It's much more accurate. You can get a diagnosis at birth. So we diagnosed Michael with gluten sensitivity. And that was 8, 9 years ago. Today he's in band. He's in high school. He's not terminal, obviously. And he's the reason I founded Gluten Free Society. Because when you do statistics on autoimmune disease, 23 million cases of autoimmune disease in the U.S. that are diagnosed, many more that are not. Yet the vast majority of these patients are being treated with high-powered medications that don't work. And the doctors will tell you they don't work. But they won't try anything else. And so I founded Gluten Free Society to disseminate the information about gluten so that we could share that gluten sensitivity can cause more than 300 types of disease. 190 of them are autoimmune diseases. And so if you're focused only on celiac disease, that's a big part of the problem. And that brings me to the topic of today, which is this. If you're diagnosed with celiac disease, went traditionally gluten-free, in other words, went wheat, barley, and rye-free, got better, your health scale went from death's door to functional, but you still have other issues like joint pain or arthritis or thyroid disease, then you're not doing it right, because those diseases are all linked to the same gluten that celiac disease is linked to. And you're just not catching it, or the doctor's just not understanding that it's the gluten that's contributing to your problems. Does that make sense? Next slide. Okay, next slide. So let's talk a little bit about what to do, how to go gluten-free right, and what to do when going gluten-free fails. And here's the thing, if the whole mission of going gluten-free is to restore your health from disease, and you've gone gluten-free and feel better, but you still are with multiple types of disease, then you're not better, right? So this is the steps. These are the next set of steps that we take to start getting better. So there's a number of things that you have to consider when going gluten-free initially. And that's the first is, depending on the age of the diagnosis, the status of a gluten gut is in grave turmoil. So we have this tissue, this intestinal tissue that's been damaged for however many years that it's been getting exposure. And so one of the first things that happens, and this was studied, and there was a study published about 6 months ago that identified that gluten can cause intestinal dysbiosis, or bacterial abnormalities in your intestine within 30 minutes of ingestion. This is one reason why we don't want to cheat. 30 minutes, bacterial changes. Now these bacteria changes can lead to abnormal processing in the gut. And for some people, these bacteria start to create alcohol. And it makes you perpetually drunk. And this is why some people with gluten sensitivity develop vertigo and Meniere's disease, dizziness, ataxia, because they're perpetually drunk. So dysbiosis is abnormal bacterial growth in the gut. And that can be measured. We can measure bacterial growth in the gut, the type of bacteria that a person has. Leaky gut, also known as intestinal permeability. Dr. Alessio Fasano discovered this about 8 or 9 years ago at the University of Maryland. They found that gluten actually causes a disruption of the enterocyte. The enterocyte are the cells in the small intestine, and they break apart. And so we get little microscopic holes penetrating into the intestines. And these little leakages, what happens over time is we start developing a lot of food allergies, because whole food proteins are now leaking through these holes. And so on the average patient I see, they're coming in, they've gone gluten-free in a traditional sense, but they've got all these other food allergies that are keeping them sick because they've had a leaky gut as a result of eating gluten for years and years and years, and nobody ever looked at other foods to try to get them to remove other foods that they were potentially reactive to. Does that make sense? The lowered capacity to produce digestive fluids, and Melinda was speaking on this in her talk. She was talking about the FODMAPs and how not having the digestive enzymes to be able to process some of the basic sugars. Very common thing that happens is the gut wears out, and the damage reduces the capacity to make digestive enzymes. Not just in the gut. Gluten can damage your pancreas, and your pancreas also produces digestive enzymes. Gluten can damage the liver, and the liver regulates blood sugar and regulates other components of how we make energy. So that lowered capacity to produce digestive fluids leads to malnutrition. Iron deficiency, vitamin D deficiency. The number one deficiency in gluten sensitivity, contrary to popular belief, is not iron. And unfortunately, this is a test that very few people ever have run, and it's vitamin B12. 99% of patients with gluten-sensitive issues have vitamin B12 deficiency, primarily because gluten damages a specific type of cell in the stomach that's responsible for making intrinsic factor. Intrinsic factor is necessary to absorb vitamin B12. The other thing that we have is immune function is compromised for a number of reasons. We said before the purpose of eating is what? Nourishment. So if what we're taking in is detrimental, our immune system is attacking what's supposed to be nourishing. And when our immune system is so busy attacking our food, it doesn't have the resources to take care of the environment. And so we're more prone to cancer, we're more prone to other illnesses with that reduced immune capacity or that reduced immune functionality. Next. So the first place to start is you have to obviously remove the offending foods. So if you're gluten sensitive, gluten obviously is one. So let's talk about the definition of gluten here for a minute though. 1952 is when the definition was created. Anybody know the history of this? It's a German physician, William Dickey. He discovered in 1952 that during World War II, his patients with celiac disease all spontaneously healed when grain was no longer available during the war. This is actually how we discovered the cause of celiac disease. And after the war, he published a study and said that the staple grains in Germany, the wheat, barley, rye, and oats, are the grains that we see, when removed, lead to spontaneous remission of patients with celiac disease.